Hello and welcome to the Exchange Mailbox Resiliency video as part of the Exchange Technical Video Series. I'm Ann Vu. I'm here with Astrid McClean to talk about Mailbox Resiliency.
Hi,
so
Ann.
Astrid, what is Mailbox Resiliency?
So email is really critical to organisations, and IT admins need to keep email up and running, make sure there's no data lost. So Mailbox Resiliency is all about keeping those mailboxes up and running so that if there are any failures, people can still access their mail.
So what kind of failures are we talking about?
Could be anything from a disk failure to a server failure to a network, or it could even be an entire site disaster.
Okay. So what are we going to be discussing today?
Okay, we're going to cover a few things today. So we're going to talk about, what the value of mailbox resiliency is. We're going to talk about large mailboxes and how they fit into the picture. And then we're going to have a couple of demos. So we're going to see how database availability groups work, how you manage them, and we're going to look at a feature called Online Mailbox Move.
Okay.
So a few things to show you how mailbox resiliency works.
So how does Exchange 2010 improve the mailbox resiliency story?
Well, what we've done is we've taken the continuous replication that we introduced in Exchange 2007, and we've really built this unified high availability disaster recovery and backup scenario for Exchange 2010.
So how does the Exchange 2010 mailbox resiliency story improve upon previous versions of Exchange?
Well, we've done a few things. So firstly, we've created this thing called a database availability group, and that includes not only high availability, but disaster recovery as well. And the second main change is that we have database level failovers. So in the past where you'd have, if something happened, you'd have the entire server failover. Now it's just at the database level, so it's much more granular.
Okay.
We've also done things like in the past where you couldn't put all of your server roles on the mailbox server once it was in high availability configuration. In 2010, especially for smaller locations, you can actually put all of the roles on a server that has high availability. So you can get high availability in as little as 2 servers.
Okay.
In terms of scale, though, we've allowed you to grow to up to 16 copies of the data. You only have, a few in the past. And in terms of the storage that we've done, it allows you to use this greater range of storage options.
So aside from high availability, which is important, what else do customers get?
So the biggest thing that they get out of all of this is the ability to deploy these really large mailboxes. So they can use the resiliency features in Exchange 2010 and deploy these mailboxes that are always available to their users.
So why do customers care about really big mailboxes?
Okay, there are a few things. So from a user perspective, it's all about user productivity. So if you've got a really small mailbox, you end up spending a lot of time shuffling mail back and forth, getting it, trying to stay under quota, and that mail typically ends up in PST files. Problem with PST files is you've only got one location that's accessible from. So you can't get at that data from, a browser. So from Outlook Web App, you can't get to your PST files, and from your mobile device. They're also a security risk. So, you've got all this information, all this company information sitting in one file. Not only is this a security risk, but if it gets corrupted, if it gets lost, suddenly you've lost access to all of that data. So from a user perspective, it's just a real time waster to have to keep shuffling mail out of their mailbox.
So what else do large mailboxes give you? What about administrators? What about them?
So from an administrator point of view, well, firstly, they don't have to take calls from grumpy users about, hey, I keep going under my quota.
Make my mailbox bigger.
Exactly. Yeah. But the other thing is those PST files become a security risk and a discovery risk from an admin point of view. Because the administrators can't find that information that easily, they can't secure that information that easily. So for them, it becomes, a benefit in having all of that information within Exchange where they can manage it. Now, the other thing they can do from a disk point of view is larger mailboxes enable them to use these larger disks far more effectively than they could in the past.
Okay, well, you're talking about disks, but I thought larger mailboxes are really expensive. So how do we better manage that?
Okay, well, we've made a few changes in 2010 around low-cost disks.
Okay.
So the way that disks are progressing, they're getting much larger, but they're not necessarily getting faster.
Okay.
So in Exchange 2010, we've changed the I/O profile of our mail. So when they access a disk, requires far less I/O from the disk than it may have in the past. And it's a 90% drop from Exchange 2003 to 2010. Now, we've done some other things. We've done things like, slowed the rate that we write to the disk. And so these slower class disks, like the SATA disks, are now much more performant when it comes to using it for Exchange. Now, when you combine those low-cost disks with the resiliency changes that we've done in Exchange 2010 means customers can now deploy large mailboxes, but at a very low cost, but still get the reliability and performance that they're used to.
That sounds really great. So you'd mentioned database availability groups. So how do those actually work?
Well, let me show you these on a PowerPoint slide so you can see, how these things work. Okay. So here we have 5 mailbox servers, and they're all in a group called a database availability group. And that means that these servers work together to manage failovers and to manage any databases that are within those servers. Now, when we have a look at our databases themselves, you can see in this diagram we've got 3 copies of database 1, and we call those instances or copies. But only 1 copy of any database is active at any one time. Okay. And what that means is, in terms of failover, we can actually fail over an individual database copy rather than failing over all of the databases from a particular server.
So I see there's more servers than there are database copies. Why do we do this?
Actually, that's a good thing from an Exchange 2010 point of view, because it means that you don't have to have this one-to-one mapping between mailbox copies or mailbox databases and servers. You can actually spread the load across more servers, and that actually lets you utilise the hardware better.
Okay.
Now, the other thing we've done is all of the failover is managed within Exchange itself, so you don't have to manage a cluster, because the database availability group actually has a cluster running underneath, but the admin doesn't have to manage that. All of that is managed through Exchange.
Okay.
So what actually happens now is that the client now collects in through the CAS server, which is a change from 2007. And so the client connects to the CAS server. The CAS server will then make the connection to the mailbox server that holds the user's active database.
Okay. So how does the CAS server know which mailbox server to go to?
Okay, so we have this process running on all of the mailbox servers called the Active Manager. Okay. And the Active Manager keeps track of which database is active, which one is passive, where the copies are. Now, we actually have an Active Manager client running on the CAS server, and that's the one that's able to pick up, it can ask questions like, where's the current active copy of this mailbox database?
Okay.
So that connection happens, and when the user goes to send an email, sends an email, and it goes down to that database. Now, that database gets updated, and the way we update the replicas is we do log shipping. So we update the database, that updates a transaction log, we then take that transaction log, and we ship it, in this case, to mailbox server 2 and 4, because that's where our databases are.
Okay.
Bad things happen to database 1. Ooh. So we have a disk failure. So in the past, the admin had to make a choice. So either we affect all users on that server and we switch all the databases over, or we leave everybody else running, and the poor people that are on database 1, they end up being down for a while we replace the disk and restore the backup.
Yeah.
But in Exchange 2010, we can fail over that single database. So Exchange now has to make the decision about, hey, I'm going to activate a database. So it activates database 1 on server 2.
Okay.
So the way it works out which database that it needs to activate is the Active Manager process we talked about. That's the one that keeps track of which copy is most up to date, so that it knows it can bring up a copy that has all of the logs, all of those logs have been replayed in. And so now when our user connects, the CAS connection goes back to mailbox server 2, and the user hasn't actually disconnected because they say connected to CAS. And that mail gets delivered, it goes down to database 1, and the same log replication happens. It goes over to mailbox server 4 to keep that data updated. And now the administrator can update, replace the disk for database 1 and take care of any of that maintenance, and the user's unaffected.
Okay. So you had discussed failures that happen within a site,
Yep.
small local failures.
Yep.
What if there is a really big disaster? What do you do in that instance?
Okay, so in that instance, if you lose an entire site, the database availability group, when you set it up, can actually be extended easily across sites.
Okay.
So in this case, we have another site in Dallas.
Okay.
And when you first set this up, you simply install another mailbox server there, and you can create copies of whatever databases you want in that alternate site. And then if there's a failure, then we can automatically switch to a database in another site. And that way you're still up and running, even with a site level disaster.
Okay, that sounds great. So you had discussed the management tools being within Exchange now. So how does that work?
Okay, I can show you that. So one of the things I want to demo is how to set up a database availability group, how you can set up a server, how you can set up copies, and how you can manage that failover.
That sounds great. Let's jump in.
Okay. So in this demonstration, we're going to show you how you can do all of that high availability management within Exchange. So the first thing you do to set up high availability is create a new database availability group. So all I have to do is give this a name. In this case, I'll call it DAG04. Normally Exchange will set up a witness server for you, but in my demonstration environment, I don't actually have a spare Exchange server, so I'm going to put in the name of one of the other servers in my environment. And I simply click New, and it creates a new database availability group. I get a warning here because my server isn't part of Exchange, but normally it would just pick an Exchange server as the witness server. I click Finish. That's all I need to do. I have a new database availability group. The next step that you normally do is once you have a database availability group is you want to add a server to it.
So Astrid, does the Exchange server have to be configured in any particular way?
So there's no particular configuration, but what needs to happen is that Exchange server that you're about to add to the database availability group needs to have Windows Enterprise Edition installed because it needs to have the failover clustering there.
Okay. So let's look at that.
So I'm going to look at my existing database availability group, DAG02, which has 2 servers in it, and I'm going to add a 3rd server. So if I right-click, I can select Manage Database Availability Group Membership, and it tells me the servers that are already there. I click Add, I can see I have one more server in my environment, a mailbox server called SLCEX03. I click OK. And when I say Manage, it's going to add that server to the database availability group.
So Astrid, are the servers in this DAG part of a cluster?
They are. So the thing that underlies the DAG is actually a failover cluster. But as you'll see when I do some more work here, you actually never need to see the cluster manager in order to install it or manage it. All of that is managed entirely within Exchange.
Okay.
So with my server EX03, there's nothing I needed to do in terms of clustering. If the failover cluster service hadn't already been installed on EX03, Exchange would have managed that for me. And we can see here that my database availability group now includes servers EX01, EX02, and my new server EX03. So the next step after adding a server to the database availability group is to create a copy of my database on that server. So I go to Database Management here, and you'll notice in Exchange 2010, all of my databases are actually managed at the organisational level, because you can see I'm still in the organisational configuration rather than being managed at the server level. And if I have a look at my database Contoso DB2, I can see that it currently only has one copy on server EX01. But I wanted to create a copy of that on my new server that I've added to the database availability group. So I can right click and say Add Mailbox Database Copy. And if I select Browse, it will give me the list of servers that don't already have a copy of that database. So I'm going to select my new server, EX03, and I select Add. And what this will do is actually add the copy of the server of the database to server EX03.
Astrid, do you need to set up the replication cluster on any other servers?
No, once you set up the database copy, it will create the copy of that database and then Exchange automatically sets up that replication schedule for you. You don't need to manage any of that.
Okay.
So my database has now been successfully created, and I can see here in the panel, or at the panel below of the status, I can see that the database is mounted on EX01 and I have a copy in a healthy state on server EX02. Now we've got these databases set up, but let's have a look and see what happens when a user is using a mailbox database that fails between these copies. So what I'm going to do is have a look at Bob Kelly's mailbox, and we'll just make sure he's happy and connected to the database. So we can see here that Bob Kelly is online and he's happily running. But what we want to have a look at is to see what database his mailbox is actually active on. So we're back to the Exchange server, we can have a look at his configuration. And if I have a look at the properties of Bob, I can see that his mailbox database is currently active on Contoso DB2, which is the one I just created a copy of. So what I'm going to do is go back to that mailbox database copy, and if I right click, I can say Move Active Mailbox Database. Now from an administration point of view, this is just simulating a failover, but it's the same process as it automatically failing over to another server. So I say Move Active Database Copy. It's currently mounted on server EX02. I select Browse and I want to move it to server EX03. And I select Move and it will move that database. So while that's happening, I can switch back to my server here and I can see that Bob is briefly disconnected, but in just a short period of time, you'll see that he will actually be reconnected to the other database. We go back to our server and we can see here that the database is in fact now mounted on EX03. Let's see if Bob noticed the change. And you see here that Bob is happily reconnected to Exchange and there was nothing he needed to do.
What's the experience if you use Outlook web app?
So for Outlook web app, it's actually a reasonably similar experience. The user's not going to see much of an interruption. They may see, a screen that says your mailbox is not available right now, but all they need to do is refresh and Exchange will automatically connect. There's no restarting of the browser or relogging on, so you get that very similar, seamless experience, and that break is going to be less than 30 seconds as we do that failover.
Okay, so just a little blip.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's it. So when we have a look at the status of the database, we can see that everything's okay, and if that database needed to be failed back to the original server, we know that Bob as a user isn't going to be impacted. Very short impact, but we can see we've got a very highly available Exchange system.
So thanks for showing me how all of this stuff is actually managed.
You're welcome.
Now with these large mailboxes, what happens to a user's individual availability if you have to move the mailbox for any reason, shuffle it around?
That's a really good question. So one of the things we've added in Exchange 2010 is this online Move Mailbox.
Okay.
Because as you mentioned in the past, if I had a very large mailbox, it took an hour or several hours to move, that means my availability was affected as my mailbox got moved. Well, in Exchange 2010, we now have an online process that what happens is we start the move of the mailbox, you can continue to access that mailbox, and it's only right at the very end of the move that we switch you to your new mailbox, and you might see just a very small blip as we move you across, but no matter what size the mailbox is, you're actually able to keep working while we're moving that mailbox. So how about I give you a look at how that works?
Let's look at that.
Okay. So in this demonstration, we're going to have a look at the online Move Mailbox feature that we've just spoken about. I'm in Bob Kelly's mailbox here, and you can see that he has access to all of his mail and he's online. So to move his mailbox, we're going to go into the administrator console and we can see Bob Kelly's mailbox here under the recipient configuration. And to move his mailbox, I simply right click and I can select New Local Move Request.
Astrid, what other types of moves are there apart from these local ones that you're showing?
Okay, so we have two main types of online moves. So one is local, the other is remote. And what the remote one does is allow you to move mailboxes between different organisations. And one of the really good kind of uses is if you want to move some of your mailboxes to the cloud, so to Exchange Online, you're actually able to use this same online move process, but it's to a remote organisation.
Oh, that's great. Move to the cloud.
Yep. Bob Kelly's mailbox is currently on Contoso Database 1. Now to move it, all we need to do here is select a new target mailbox database. So I select Browse and I'm going to move his database to Database 2. Now we have a choice to decide whether we want to move just his user mailbox or his archive as well. But in this case we'll just be moving his mailbox. So I click Next. I can decide what I want to do in case of corrupted messages, but we don't think we have any in Bob's mailbox today. So we select Next, then I select New, and that submits a new request to the client access server that then kicks off the move.
So is this process different from previous versions?
Actually, it's significantly different to the previous versions. So here, it submitted the Mailbox Move request to the Client Access Server. In the past, what we've done is that move process has been tied to the administration console. So if anything happened to that, we lost the move. Now with it being managed by the Client Access Server, we can pick up that move if there's a problem with the server. We can pick it up with another server, we can keep it going, and you can always check the status of what's happening. So it's a far more robust process than it used to be.
I see.
So now that I've finished that move request, we can have a look and see what's happening at Bob's mailbox, because remember, it's being moved at this point. But you can see, despite the fact that it's being moved, he's still online, he can still access all of his mail. So he's working online and isn't disrupted by the fact that his mailbox is being moved. So from an administration point of view, when I go back to the administration console, I can track the progress of his move by going to this move request list. So we can see here we have Bob Kelly's mailbox. We can see that it's got a status of moving. And if I have a look at the properties of that, it will give me some additional detail about, what it's doing, when it's complete, the number of items that have been moved, as well as, the size of the mailbox. So the administrator can keep track, but Bob stays up and running for the entire time of the move. So that's online Move Mailbox.
Great.
So to summarise all the things we've been talking about, Exchange 2010 allows people to deploy large, low-cost mailboxes. It means that Exchange doesn't need to use expensive disks anymore. You really can use those cheaper disks.
Great.
So now you can use all of those high resiliency features in Exchange 2010, like the database availability groups, the multiple copies, as well as things like the online Move Mailbox, and still get really good performance and excellent availability with Exchange 2010, but it's not costing you a fortune to do that.
That's great. This is really good information. So where do IT administrators and our friends go to find more information about this?
We've got a couple of good resources. So one we've got is the Large Mailbox Vision Whitepaper, and that talks about this idea of using these larger disks and why it's more effective to have larger mailboxes on these large disks. So that's a really good overview. And that's not a really technical white paper, so that's the sort of thing that you can hand to, a bunch of people to help explain, how Exchange, manages its storage now.
Okay.
We've also got something called the top 10 Exchange storage myths, because there's been a lot of, kind of confusion about, what storage we support, as well as some aspects of the high availability and, hey, too many copies, what does this mean for me? So we've got the top 10 storage myths answered for people. And then we've got, an overview on Microsoft.com, plus we've got a few TechNet resources here. One is an overview of the high availability and site resilience, and the other one is understanding the high availability factors and what you should be thinking about when you design these systems.
Oh, that's really good. Thanks, that was really helpful.
You're welcome.
And thanks for watching the Exchange Mailbox Resiliency videos. Please check out some of our other videos out of the Exchange Technical Video Series, including the Outlook Web App, and management videos. Thanks for watching.